The LGBT community in its modern form is not tolerant.
100 non-binary people will have 100 different ways of being non-binary.
You're not breaking the binary. You're reinforcing it.
I'd like to go to some tribes in Africa and see if they have traditional gender roles or not. I'm thinking they probably do.
Even transgender people, I agree with your opinions, but if I said this in front of my LGBT friend group, I'd be kicked out. So I've just leaned into it. And you know what? It has a lot of downsides.
Scoliosexual. Primary attraction to transgender individuals, specifically non-binary trans people.
I'm the opposite because I'm specifically not interested in anyone who identifies as non-binary. When you're gay, you already have a limited dating pool. Really tough time dating. I felt very lonely, but you simply have to be willing to coexist with people. And that's very much what I'm willing to do. Basically, nobody in American politics embodies those things consistently. Because hate speech just means speech that somebody else hates.
People sort of assume that we are very anti-free speech.
But you are, though. Actually think that on the trans debate, the UK has been ahead of us by several years. Now, I guess I just think of myself as over here on an island, screaming into the void. Polumbo 2024. There is no solution.
Hope this helps.
Rad Polumbo, welcome to my podcast. I'm so honored to have you here. So yeah, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate you reaching out.
No worries. I've been watching you for probably a year. So yeah, a big fan. I'm based in the UK, so I've learned a lot about American politics from you. And I'm also gay, as you probably know. So yeah, it's great to have people speaking, with reason and sense online. There aren't too many, but we're starting to see more and more.
Are you a football or soccer fan at all?
Unfortunately not. No, the only sport I like is tennis. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a big Chelsea fan, so whenever I meet somebody from the UK, I try to talk to them about football, but more often than not, they're not even into it.
Yeah, I'm literally the last person on earth you should ask questions about that. I mean, it's huge, it's huge here. So if I'm at work and people say, "Oh, I'm watching the match tonight," we say match, not game. And I don't even know what sport they say it as if I'm supposed to just know, oh, right. But I'm like, what sport? Is it rugby or is it football? And they always just shake their head. So I'm sure you need no introduction, but for anyone who has not seen you before, please, say a bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I'm a YouTuber and podcaster. I host the Damage Control podcast, which is dedicated to reclaiming the debate over LGBT issues from the crazy people who've taken it over. Because I think both on the kind of far left woke alphabet mafia side, we've got a lot of loony people who are doing a lot of damage to the LGBT community and giving a lot of everyday, sane, rational gays, lesbians, and transsexuals a bad name. And then I think on the other side, you've got an increasingly, and maybe it's a little different in the UK, and we can get into that, but in the US, I think we're seeing something of a backsliding, a little bit of a backlash to the LGBT community, where a couple of years ago, particularly on the right of center American politics, there was a higher degree of tolerance and acceptance, but it's seeming to be reversing a little bit in the face of the more extreme elements. And then at the behest of some people who I think were always homophobic, but have kind of for a while maybe felt they needed to be quiet about it, but now feel comfortable with this backlash to rail against the LGBT community very broadly and to kind of push back from even where we were back in 2018, 2019, 2020, where on the American right, at least towards gays and lesbians, the trans stuff has been more controversial for always. But there really was something of a detente, right? Like there was not a huge culture war over gay rights in 2018, 2019, 2020, 2021. It was really only in 2023 coming into 2024 where we start to see this reemerge. And I think it's a complicated issue, but it's one I'm really concerned about. So that's why I launched the Damage Control podcast, which is on all platforms, but primarily on YouTube. And it's been the central focus of that show is reclaiming the debate over these issues from the crazy people.
Yeah, well, I definitely watched that, so it's really great. And if anyone's not seen it, I highly recommend you go check it out. I think what's great about it is that you do attack, but well, attack is a strong word, but you do criticize both sides. And it's quite common for us to see commentators on YouTube just go very far down one path, and even if they disagree with something on the right, they probably won't mention it. So I think that's great to see, because you really hold both sides to account, and you sort of prove the fact that you're not some far right fascist, although I'm sure a lot of the lefty loonies will still label you that.
Yeah, I mean, I get all sorts of labels, and I do push back on the right. I will say the easiest thing to do is to just train your ire in one direction. So, like, if I was just going for clicks and to maximize subscriber growth, all I would do is make fun of woke LGBT TikToks. But I have a little more integrity than that, and I want to push back in both directions and genuinely speak my mind on things. So I do a kind of broader array of criticism than just that. I certainly do plenty of that, and it is fun. But yeah, I push back on the right, and I will lose subscribers. People will get mad, but ultimately, it's like, if you're not doing that, what's the point of having a platform if you can't even use it to articulate your true beliefs? If you become beholden to a diehard audience that only wants their views and beliefs already that they hold confirmed by you, I think that's boring, and I wouldn't want to do that with my life's work. So it's a slower path to growth, right? The fastest path to growth is just to embrace and pander to one extreme base, either the extreme left base, and you can become hyper woke and start canceling people, and until it's your turn to be canceled, they might follow you and you might gain in popularity and notoriety, or the right wing base, and you can just become kind of a talking head for the opposite side and look the other way on all the bad and messed up things that are going on your side, and you'll have a lot of newfound fans. But to me, that's boring. To me, that lacks integrity. And so I try not to fall into that trap, even though unfortunately the digital ecosystem tends to incentivize that kind of approach.
And impose it on you as much as possible. I think it's such a great point, but I think what you said about being able to, start a platform going down one path, I think you might reach growth faster, but then you'll inevitably have a shorter life, right? And I think staying true to yourself, you can see that. I think it's what draws people to creators. They can tell that they're staying true to their values. They're open to changing their mind about stuff. And obviously your channel is really blowing up lately. So congratulations for that. And I'm sure that's a big part of it.
Yeah, it's tough because, I probably posted on YouTube for like over a year, maybe a year and a half before much stuff started getting traction. And even now it's very inconsistent and up and down and so hard to make sense of. Especially when you try to talk about substantive things sometimes and not just crazy culture and crazy social media stories. But some people have started following me on YouTube. We crossed 122,000, I think, yesterday. So that's pretty cool. Started to get, millions of views per month across the different content and series that I make. And I don't take that for granted. I really appreciate the following I've built up there and how a lot of people follow me who don't agree with everything I say, because I have a pretty niche worldview, right? Like the percentage of the American public that has similar politics to me is almost certainly a single digit percentage. But so that means that for me to have a lot of followers, it means a lot of people are something about the content I'm making is registering enough with them in its authenticity that they're willing to stick around even when they don't always agree with the message. And I really appreciate that, because that's the kind of attitude I think is becoming lost, right? Just this ability to have conversations, to hear other viewpoints without getting triggered or calling people names or filming yourself crying in the car for a TikTok. That was very much a quintessential American mentality, but a lot of people have lost it. So I've tried my best to cultivate an audience that can handle hearing things they don't always agree with and doesn't expect to be pandered to 100% of the time.
Yeah. Yeah, and you also promote that value in itself, which is good. So it's even teaching your audience to be prepared for, if you say something they disagree with, they're sort of learning that skill as they go. And YouTube is an amazing platform. I mean, it is a slow burn, right? But I feel like it is one of the most rewarding, because you have to put in the highest amount of time commitment compared to Instagram or TikTok. And I think it's
Oh,
easier
yeah.
to gain like a loyal fan base who really care about what you have to say.
It's easier to have, like on TikTok or whatever, it's easier to have one video blow up and get a lot of
Yeah.
views, but it's a lot
Mhm.
harder to cultivate a long-term audience that's really connected and resonates with you and will support you on a Patreon or buy your book or do something like that. YouTube subscribers who are regular viewers, they really do, like, honestly, it's kind of humbling to talk to
Mhm.
people and to hear them and be like, yeah, I listen to you every day when I live alone in another city, I'm studying abroad and haven't made any friends, and I listen to you while I eat my dinner every night or something, like, or I'll get a note, it'll be like, my husband died last year and I've been really lonely, but you make me laugh every day. Like, the
Wow.
role that, and I'm sure, even if it's on a smaller scale, that people who watch your content, it's filling a role in their lives. Like, one of the things I always recommend to YouTubers, that if you want to become a YouTuber, is you have to become a YouTube consumer, because then you'll kind of learn how it works. And I have a couple of YouTubers that I listen to on a near daily basis for 15, 20, 30 minutes of the day. They have no idea who I am or that I exist or that I watch their content, but they're like a little piece of my daily life. And I don't take that for granted, because it's actually really, really remarkable when you think about it. It's easy to forget about it and just look at, like, line goes up on graph, but each one of those is a person listening to you and forming basically one-way relationship with you in their head. And that's really something to not be taken for granted. It's actually something I really find quite humbling.
100% agree. And, I have a small platform right now, but even I get emails sometimes. And when you choose to talk about some of these topics, or even just be tolerant of different opinions, inevitably you're going to have problems, right? So I guess issues in my personal life, they've really been outweighed. When I get those doubts coming in, then when I see all of those kind emails, comments, it really keeps me going, because I think, wow, I'm really making a difference. And within the UK, there's really not many LGBT people talking about this kind of stuff. So, and I wouldn't even say I'm that extreme. But so, Brad, I'd love to understand a bit about your background, because you got into this space quite young. I'm a few years older than you, but you really struck me as someone who is able to articulate a point using facts and logic and base comments far more than people 20 years your senior. So I'd love to know about your background, through life and politics, and what sort of led you to doing what you do now and knowing so much.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think that making arguments and rhetoric is a skill in and of itself. And I've become very good at debating, very good at arguing, monologuing, writing, a lot of that stuff. My background was originally in traditional media, but so that's what I did right after graduating, is I worked at a magazine. But in college, I actually worked at the campus newspaper, and I thought I wanted to be a lawyer, right? Because I was always very argumentative and contrarian as a child, and I always was interested in politics and the law. And so I also did competitive mock trial for all 3 years that I was in college. And I was one of the captains of the team, and I was a pretty elite. Mock trial is similar to debate competition, but it's structured in the form of arguing a case in a courtroom and conducting a trial. And I argued at a pretty elite level and competed at a very high level, but I got very good at using a mixture of rhetoric and facts and argumentation to convince people or to get a point across. And I got very good at picking apart arguments, about rebutting people, thinking on your feet, all things that you need. And then I kind of further honed these things through being a young writer in the political commentary scene, and then doing television. I did a lot I was on TV a lot, a little bit, not so often nowadays, but for a couple of years, I was on TV almost every week, arguing and having these debates and doing this stuff. And all of that really kind of lends itself to this new media, though you have to be more casual, and it's less buttoned up and it's less professional. And so I'm still working on that to try to, be a little more chill, a little more down to earth, a little more relatable, a little less stiff, a little less formal. But I guess that's the really short, condensed version. I've also just never really been afraid to offend people, but I've also never really wanted to. Like I've never been a jerk just to be a jerk, at least in my political commentary career, but I'm not afraid to say something, even if it will ruffle feathers. In fact, I welcome it. And so I tend to view those kinds of things as a challenge rather than as a hurdle, whereas a lot of people are essentially scared into silence, especially in the LGBT community, because I get so many messages from gay, lesbian, and even transgender people who are like, oh, I agree with your opinions, but if I said this in front of my LGBT friend group, I'd be kicked out. Like, if I said I don't think it's fair for biological males to compete in women's sports, they'd all say I'm transphobic or this stuff. And it's like there's this real culture that leads to intolerance of difference in viewpoints that leads people to self-censor. And I've never been able to do that. I am an open book. Like my face, I used to get me in trouble in high school because teachers would say something to me or a coach would say something to me and my face would just react with how stupid I thought it was. And I'd literally get detention. I've always been an open book, so it's never really been a choice for me. I haven't been able to hide my thoughts very well. So I've just leaned into it. And you know what? It has a lot of downsides. When I moved to Washington, D.C. after college, I tried to get involved in the local gay community, and I was pretty quickly excommunicated. So I joined a soccer club for gay men, and I was essentially pushed out of it and told that my dangerous opinions, like children shouldn't irreversibly medically transition, put hypothetical, not actual, there were no actual transgender people in the club, hypothetical trans people who might join in the future were put in physical danger by my views. That was what was said. So I was excommunicated from that group. I never really had any gay friends. I had an extremely hard time dating. I finally did find someone, but it was who I've been with for a very long time since, but it was a very rough experience. Almost, I mean, when you're gay, you already have a limited dating pool, right? Much more limited than most people. And then even within that, you know, only a small slice of the gay community in the in their early 20s is looking for an actual relationship or wants to go on dates or was looking for what I was looking for. And then when you further segment it, by the vast majority aren't open to dating anybody who's not a liberal or a progressive. I mean, it was like looking just 1 in a million odds. And I had a really tough time dating. I felt very lonely for a long time. And then I finally did find the right person for me and it worked out for me in the end. But that's all just to say that speaking out about this stuff is not easy. And so I understand why people are quiet about it. But I do think that it gets easier the more and more that people do it. So like originally back, like you go 10 years ago or 8 years ago, it was literally just Blair White and like maybe Guy Benson. There were like 2 people who were openly LGBT and right-leaning in their politics in all of the internet, in all of political media of any prominence or note. And over the years, it's just increased and increased and increased. And I think the more it increases, the more that opens up the Overton window and normalizes having different viewpoints in the LGBT community. And so it becomes easier and easier for people to follow in the footsteps. And I welcome that. I think it's the more the merrier because it will just foster more tolerance for different viewpoints and dialogue and discussion. And it's sorely needed because the LGBT community in its modern form is not tolerant. It's not tolerant at all of thinking differently, of difference in perspectives, of different values, of open-mindedness, of classically liberal values, of open dialogue and debate. It's very much obsessed with diversity, but only diversity that goes skin deep. Not diversity in viewpoint or religion or ideology or beliefs or values, just an extremely superficial vision of diversity. A bunch of people who all look differently but think the same. And that's, as far as the LGBT community goes, what it's becoming, but that's not actually a tolerant or open-minded movement. It's a reductive one.
Absolutely. 100% agree. And it's the same here, you know. Well, it's quite a journey you've been on. A few things you mentioned, I think you get the balance really well with your criticism of the Delulus, as I think you call them. Because you can be critical, but also do it in good faith, I feel.
I try not to be mean. Sometimes like LGBT commentators are kind of mean to the woke delusional people and like make fun of their appearances and all that. But oftentimes I do end up ultimately try to avoid that because a lot of these people aren't well.
Yeah, agree. And it's a balance I have struggled with at times. I think sometimes I end up editing out a lot. I sort of let my heart run rampant, and then I have to scale it back in the editing. I think when you mentioned before that your politics is 1-2%, could you explain a bit about your broad political views? I feel like you're going to say it's, libertarianism, but I'd love to understand more about what your values are and why are they just the 1%?
Well, I would say that my values are somewhere on the libertarian to classical liberal perspective. So very much about individualism, freedom, limited government, and then tolerance. So I would not describe myself as socially liberal, fiscally conservative. I find that to be a very simplistic way of thinking because you don't actually have to be socially liberal. You have to be socially tolerant, which simply means not trying to force your way of life onto other people. Doesn't mean you have to approve or validate or celebrate or normalize everything under the sun, but you simply have to be willing to coexist with people. And that's very much what I'm willing to do, is that I believe in coexistence. I believe in tolerance. I believe in free exchange and openness. And those are the values that I think inform my worldview and my political perspective. And I think, basically nobody in American politics embodies those things consistently. On some issues, you have people on one side of the spectrum that embody a open-minded and tolerant worldview, and then on some issues, those same people are authoritarians and want you to make bigot or be crushed by the boot of the government or to use my pronouns or else. And then on the other hand, you have people, Ben Shapiro talked about the local government banning men from wearing women's clothes, whatever that means, as if that's compatible with a free society or anything close to the proper role of government. So if you actually just want to live and let live, have a small but not non-existent government. I'm not an anarchist. I don't take that intellectual strain very seriously, to be honest. And if you actually want to let people live and trade and exchange and in freedom and coexistence and tolerance, well, there's just not a lot of allies in mainstream politics. And then also a lot of people, in terms of the actual voters, think they believe in things, but they actually don't. Because most Americans have lives and jobs and families to take care of, and they don't think about politics at a deep level or in a principle or ideological sense. So I'll give you a good example. If you poll Republicans and say, do you believe in freedom of religion? Almost all of them will say yes. But if you also poll Republicans and say, should mosques be allowed to be opened in your neighborhood? A shocking percentage of them will say no, right? And so you have a cognitive dissonance there. People think they believe something, but they actually don't. If you poll liberals in America and ask, do you believe in free speech? They will say, yes, of course. Huge majorities will say yes. Now, if you ask them, but what about hate speech? They'll say, well, no, that doesn't count. Of course, that's totally cognitively dissonant because hate speech just means speech that somebody else hates. And so if you have hate speech carved out from free speech, then there's no free speech at all. And so that's what I mean when I say that only a tiny minority of the public shares my political views. It's that most Americans are ideologically inconsistent. And so even if they might agree with me on theory on something, very few have consistently embodied it in their politics and their worldview in the way that I personally do. So I don't know. I guess I just think of myself as over here on an island, screaming into the void, doing my own thing. That's why, when I'm making a criticism of Biden, sometimes people will be like, well, but your guy, Donald Trump, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, no, I've never voted for Trump. I've never supported Donald Trump. You don't know who you're talking to, but people can only think in this tribalistic sense. In the same way, when I make a criticism of right-wing people, they'll be like, wow, liberals always say this. And I'm like, nothing about me is liberal. I'm, if anything, I'm center right in my politics, and liberals hate me and would disown me. So you're just assuming because I disagree with you about something, I must be a full blown like Hillary Clinton supporter or something. And people really do think of politics in this black or white, with us or against us fashion. And I don't view the world that way. I've never viewed the world that way. And so that's why I feel so isolated and out of touch with most people politically, honestly.
That is tough. I mean, it's funny when you mentioned your partner, because I happened to start dating someone who was already sort of center right almost 5 years ago, but I was very lefty. This is kind of what's led me to speaking about this, because my red pilling, or if you want to call it that, but my awakening was so disturbing that I thought, wow, how could I be so entrenched in this? And now my opinions are verging far more towards what everything you just described. But I've noticed since I started speaking out about this stuff, there are people who try and take me to the other side and hold me accountable. So, I speak a lot on the gender discourse, and I have quite similar views to you. I don't believe in stopping gender medicine for adults and everyone. I think some people benefit from this, but against the child transitioners. And there's this just forever growing community in the UK of TERFs on Twitter. And they'll sort of try and hold me accountable for things I say, or using a pronoun for someone, as if I'm sort of part of their tribe. So you can really see that no matter what direction you go in, you end up being in a community that wants a flag and has a list of do's and don'ts. So it's hard being a free thinker. This may be a hot take, but I've heard before, people who are more intelligent tend to lean a little bit more right. What would your thought be on that?
I don't know. I think the problem with that is that there are different types of intelligence. And so I know some people who are extraordinarily intelligent. Honestly, to be honest with you, Elon Musk is a good example of this. He's obviously brilliant. He's obviously a genius when it comes to science and matters of technology. But then sometimes he'll just like say the most cartoonishly like low IQ tweets. Like he'll just say something like ridiculously absurd. And you're like, how can somebody so smart say something so dumb? And it's like, well, because there are different types of intelligence, right? There are many different types of intelligence. And so, for example, I would like to think that I have pretty high levels of critical thinking, of rhetoric, of reading comprehension and writing, but I have very low emotional intelligence. I'm very bad at I would be the worst therapist in the world. I'm very bad at empathizing with people or like interpreting their emotions or what they're feeling, but they're not really saying. Like I'd be the worst therapist in the world. I'm not always the best friend, right? Like that's a whole category of intelligence where I would be like bottom percentile, right? But then on another category, I might be a very high percentile. When it comes to like being really intelligent in terms of mechanics and the way that things work. I know people who, for example, finished high school and didn't go to college, and you'd think, oh, and they got like C's in high school, and you think like, oh, they must not be very smart. But then they flip open a car and they start talking about how it works. And I'm like, you might as well be speaking Mandarin. And I'm so impressed by the intricacies with which you're able to understand how all these different things are interconnected. And I could never do that, but I could test well in school and I was book smart. But so am I smarter than you, or are we intelligent in very fundamentally different ways? I mean, there are some people who are just good at nothing, but that's a relatively low percentage of the population. So I guess what I would say is I imagine that certain types of intelligence lead to certain political views. And I can see how high degrees of emotional intelligence would actually perhaps lead someone to a leftward viewpoint. Because a lot of, in my opinion, progressive viewpoints are rooted in emotion and compassion, less so than raw pragmatism and logic. And sometimes right-leaning viewpoints can be cold and dispassionate, but are hyperlogical or are callous, but are, maybe more rooted, at least in my view, in a rational approach that tries to isolate human emotion. And maybe that's not always the best thing to do, because humanity is human. And so when we're making rules and policies for humanity, the whole facts don't care about your feelings thing was a big thing popularized by Ben Shapiro. And on one hand, it's a good point. But on the flip side, feelings also don't really care about your facts. And so if you actually are trying to convince people, you can't solely make arguments in the realms of data and numbers and logic, because what actually convinces people more often than not are stories and our emotional connections to characters or people or groups that are affected by something. And so that's an extremely long-winded way of answering that, but I don't know the relationship there between intelligence and politics.
Well, you said you had good critical thinking intelligence, and you definitely showed it in your answer there, because you were able to really examine all the sides. I guess in my mind, I was sort of thinking political intelligence, but then you mentioned the different streams of political intelligence, which can be a big emotional element. I think I relate more to that side in terms of my innate natural qualities, but now I've become a lot more pragmatic. And I think it's interesting when you say compassion, because I feel like a lot of left ideas are a little bit utopian and compassion for the here and now. But then sometimes while so policies and ideas can seem cold, they sometimes, aim for a more compassionate future. So I think a lot of left people will think if you're right wing, you just don't care about disadvantaged, low socioeconomic status people. But I think my understanding is that a lot of right-wing people view growing the economy and empowering people to have freedom actually releases those people from traps in which the government sort of keep them in by providing benefits and kind of little incentive to move outward of that. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I do. I think a good example of this is one of the things I've argued with people a lot over the years about is the minimum wage, and in pushing to hike the minimum wage to $15 an hour. And I've always opposed that. That's the big push here in the United States. And they're like, well, you don't care about the working class. You don't care about the working poor. You don't want people to have a fair and living wage. You're just shilling for big corporations. And it's actually not that, but I can see how they're so overrun with compassion and emotion to want to help these people that they are not focused on the second and third order consequences. So, for example, there was a very famous study done here in the US that showed that roughly 100% of the cost of increased minimum wages affecting McDonald's stores was passed on through higher menu prices. So, in that case, guess who eats McDonald's? It is not the rich. It is not the college educated. It is the poor and the working class. And so you think you're helping them, but you're actually just giving with one hand and taking from the other. And in the process, doing other harms. So there's all these second and third order consequences that they didn't think about. So another great example of this was during the COVID pandemic here, we had a so-called eviction moratorium where the government basically prohibited most landlords from evicting people during the pandemic. And people supported this and defended this from this place of emotion, like, oh my gosh, we don't want people evicted during the pandemic when they're going to be hard up. What they didn't realize was that by taking away the threat of eviction, you had this massive problem for landlords who would have non-paying tenants they couldn't get rid of. And a bunch of them responded by leaving units empty, because it was so risky for them in these low-income rental units that if they rented it out and then didn't get paid, they would lose money on the utilities every month, right? Because they'd still have to pay for that no matter what. And so they had units sitting empty because they weren't able to actually enforce the payment of collection. And so the rental crisis got worse during the pandemic, not better. And so I tend to look at things with a deep skepticism towards top-down solutions and always think about the second or third order consequences that so often dwarf the first order consequences that are the intent of the policy. Whereas I think a lot of people, and so another thing, sometimes doing nothing is better. And people have a real hard time with that. That if you have a problem and there's a solution proposed that in the long run is a net negative, you are better off doing nothing. But that is not a good campaign slogan. Polumbo 2024, there is no solution, is not going to win people's votes and hearts and minds as much as Polumbo 2024, I'll give you free money, right? Or I'll solve your problem. Like, it's just the political system is strongly biased towards people who make promises they can't back up and towards solutions that promise great outcomes, but even if they don't actually work in the long run, well, heck, I'll be out of office by then. I mean, actually, there was reporting that Trump said this, and basically every president has said this. You know, the national debt is going to be a huge problem for America, but I'll be out of office by then, right? That's actually how they think. And so the political system is warped towards action and towards solutions rather than pragmatism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally agree. It's the exact same here. And the situation you described with the housing, Scotland did the same thing. But not only did they ban evictions, they also put a cap on rent increase. And Scotland is like our Canada, right? I live in London. So that was a disaster. And then I'm also from Ireland, although I've lived here 10 years. And they adopted gender self-ID under the cover. There was no referendum. They didn't think it through. They just thought, oh, this will be nice for the very small minority of trans people we have. And then the downstream effect of that is they had multiple violent rapists put into women's prisons because legally they were 100% female. And the politicians just said, you know, many of them women just said, wow, we didn't think of this. And it's a broader issue of all the trans stuff, of course, but I totally agree. It is a natural human condition to actually think more about short-term consequence than long, which is why a lot of people find it difficult to get into the gym and stuff like that, because they really need to stick with it for months before they see benefits and go, oh, this is great. I'm going to keep doing this now. So I think to be someone who naturally leans towards long-term consequence, long-term goal is actually relatively rare in terms of humans. So the last question I want to ask you before we dive into the fun bit is your impression of the UK, because my idea is people here are obsessed with America, but I feel like the Americans aren't obsessed with us, especially when it comes to stuff like the royal family. And we do import a lot of your ideas, your media, your trends. So I think it kind of mainly goes in that direction. But specifically from an LGBT lens, what is your impression of the difference between here and where you are?
So this is a very interesting one, because I agree with you that on most things, I think the US the UK kind of stuff flows from the US to the UK. But I actually think that on the trans debate, the UK has been ahead of us by several years. So I can remember back 5 years ago, there were these robust debates over trans in the UK and TERFs and all this stuff. TERFs versus the gender critical and the fights over the Equality Act and all this stuff. Yet nobody was even talking about these issues, or at least not very much 5 years ago in the US. It was much smaller than it is now. I also think that I would say the UK, this is just my perception, is more solidly pro-gay than the United States, though the United States has become more pro-gay. I feel like it's just less. I don't even see a widespread belief in the UK that gay marriage shouldn't be allowed, or that like gay people shouldn't be protected under discrimination laws. Whereas there's still like a solid chunk of our country that believes that, even though a majority no longer believes that. That's still very much like a real, like somewhat live debate in the US. On trans, though, I actually view the UK as more anti-trans than the US, at least lately. I feel like the pendulum has really swung there to the point where I'm seeing even Labour people, and maybe I'm only seeing spots here and there because I only tune in and out when something catches my eye, but I feel like I'm seeing even lefty Labour people becoming gender critical and turning their back on kind of the trans extreme full embrace. But maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. I just feel like whenever I hear the loudest, most maximalistly anti-trans voice, it's almost always a British woman.
Well, I mean, I agree. I think that's one of the biggest differences. And I think when it comes to gay marriage, I also agree. But we've been secular a lot longer than the US has. So religion is really not as fundamental to our culture. There is still remnants of Christianity, which was the foundation of our culture, but we're far more multicultural in terms of religion. Like we have so many in the Islam community, Jewish community, et cetera, et cetera. And I know you do too, but I think for us, when you look at the conservative party or the right kind of ideology, it doesn't necessarily correlate as much with Christianity as Republicans would, I think. So I feel like maybe that's made it more tolerant because we sort of separate it from religion. And then I agree we were ahead of you with the trans stuff. Now it's got very chaotic. And I honestly think J.K. Rowling has really paved the path for allowing certain women to feel like they can speak, which I think is a really good thing. But I also agree that there is a level of hate that does concern me. And I think it's great that women can feel open to talking about protecting their spaces, protecting their prisons. But it kind of disappoints me to see such a large amount of faceless Twitter profiles of women who just like their only job seems to be to find photos of trans women and ridicule them. And I'm saying, okay, that's not necessary. Like, sure, there might be some trans women who actually cause issues and behave badly, and we should call that out. And the community should be calling that out, but they're not. So I think, yeah, that does concern me. And then I think people sort of maybe wrongly assume that we are very anti-free speech because we have these strange little laws that have been drifting around, and Scotland just implemented the most insane law.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but you are, though. You are.
But
your laws are, at least. I don't know about your society. Your laws are.
I agree. I just can't imagine how that law will be put into practice. I think everyone's just dismayed. Like, who asked for this? It doesn't seem like anyone but fringe activists really want that. And it comes back to your point about politicians kind of, they're very much in the here and now as well, because we see a lot of politicians not make meaningful change, but they want to enact one very specific thing so that they can say, I'm the person that did that. And our prime minister was trying to put a bill forward for a smoking ban, which would mean every year that someone is born, there would be a new age range that would never be able to buy cigarettes, for example, if that makes sense. So they'd slowly fade out the ability. And everyone was saying, no one asked for this. It's a waste of resources, waste of time. But it's sort of his stance to say, I'm the guy who did that.
That's Rishi Sunak who did that?
Yeah, it's not been passed, but he's been trying to put it through.
Just so interesting though, because even the conservative people in British politics are so
they're not
they're so on the scale of believing in a small government or a big government, they're still so far towards the big government from where we sit. Absolutely. That is nanny state insanity, micromanaging people's individual freedom and decision making. It's one thing to say that because smoking cigarettes has costs that affect other people, we put a tax on it, right? That's one thing. But to say you can't even make this decision, you are not allowed, is totally anathema to individual freedom and choice. And that's something that Republicans here just would get crucified if they tried to do.
Yeah. It's definitely different here. And I think I'm surprised we even knew the Labour Party, because I feel like people just don't get our politics here. But they, the two sides are pretty much just the same. There is no difference between our center left, center right party, although certain people seem to think there are. None of them are really proposing anything radical or anything with a clear vision right now. And the last point I'll add is that it's weird because the gender critical side here is far more on the left, actually. We have it's far more left than right. I think a lot of right-wing people are just not even thinking about it, to be honest. So that's a key difference too. But I do hope things improve. I hope that we can take the pros.
In US context, almost all the gender critical stuff is right-wing. There's very, very little left. There are some, but I'm saying it's primarily of the right, the pushback to the trans stuff.
Mm-hmm. And I think, so nanny state, I'm definitely against. I mean, we have our National Health Service, which is just hemorrhaging money and taxes. So I'm sort of more for semi-privatizing it so the wealthy can get health insurance and, we can prioritize people with less money. But one advantage of this nanny state we have is that cracking down on youth gender medicine we were able to do that in one sweep. Whereas obviously in your case, that's a huge, like a bigger mountain to climb. You have some states enacting it, and therefore those states become evil states. Whereas here, it's sort of like everyone said, okay, this must be the right decision. The majority of people, obviously some people are not, because it is a national decision, I guess.
There are pros and cons to that, though, because one of the things that's good about the United States system is because we are a much bigger and much more diverse society than somewhere like the UK. The only way we can coexist peacefully without a civil war, right, is like, or without a breaking up, is if California is allowed to be California and Texas is allowed to be Texas. So, I mean, because if you tried to force Texans and the Californians to live under the same laws, right? So like if you tried to ban guns in Texas or ban all abortion in California, you would genuinely have like uprising that could lead to national divorce or civil war. So the reason that we can't have one size fits all policies in the US is because our societies at the state level and our populations are so different that what we've instead done is kind of self-sorted, that people live in places that align with their values most of the time, and then they can have different regimes and rules. And the downside of that is, I agree, it makes change harder to achieve, and there's a lack of uniformity. The upside is that it's called a laboratory of democracies, right? You can see which ideas work and which don't. Different people with different value sets can live under policy regimes that align with their values. So I tend to view that kind of thing as having more upsides than downsides in the American context.
Yeah, I do agree. I think it can be easy to have one great decision with a wide sweeping thing like that, but then whoever advocates for it, it'll come back to bite them in the ass, because then they'll be the victim of a decision they don't like. Well, thank you, Brad. That was so interesting hearing about all your perspectives on this. And the next part, you are no stranger to. You spent a lot of your time doing this, and I'm sure, as you say, you've lost many brain cells and you're about to lose some more. So I picked a good topic for this woke TikTok reaction, because I know that you have very quote unquote positive views on non-binary, right? So we're gonna have a look at some non-binary TikToks. This non-binary TikToker uses he/him pronouns.
So this might be confusing for some people. So like I use he/him pronouns, right? But I don't identify as a man. But I'm trans non-binary. And I feel dysphoric about my body sometimes, like my curves and my butt. But at the same time, I like my boobs. That's fine.
Say what?
The math is not mathing. I use he/him, but I don't identify as a man. I present completely like a female, just a female who would struggle to pass through a metal detector. I don't know. Like, I don't like to make fun of these people because all I see is somebody deeply confused and probably with some trauma or some issues are going on in the inside. But I mean, I've said this before, and I know this is a hot take or whatever, but like non-binary isn't a legitimate concept. It's not coherent. It means nothing. And there are two sexes, and then you can't really change. You can live as the other, but there is no third, with the extremely rare exception of some intersex genetic conditions, which almost never actually apply to these individuals in question, right? There are males and there are females, and wanting to present a certain way doesn't make you not a male or not a female. It just makes you a female who likes to dress in a more masculine way or wants short hair or whatever, and that's totally fine. But then it's even more incoherent when you have people who don't even embrace the androgyny, yet want to be called the other pronouns while also saying they're non-binary. I mean, I can't keep up. Imagine how like some random 50-year-old who, who didn't grow up embodied in all this online nonsense, they must see this and think that the LGBT community has been hitting the crack pipe.
And it's why it's even crazier when you see a 50-year-old on TikTok that actually buys into this and you think, what the hell? Well, this girl, she says, I like my boobs, but I'm dysphoric about my butt or something. And it's like it's teaching kids to view everything through this gender lens, whereas it's like, babe, loads of us have body issues. In fact, the most of us do. It doesn't necessarily mean you're now not a woman.
That's normal to be a teenager and like not liking or being comfortable with certain parts of your body. Like, why are we pathologizing that?
Mm-hmm. And I do really think a lot of this community, autism is quite common. I looked at her TikTok and it says autistic, and I see that a lot, right? And it kind of made me feel sad because her latest videos are obviously post taking a certain level of testosterone. The way some of them like to take a little bit and then come off, so they have a little bit more androgyny. So she kind of is the same, but just has a bit of a beard. And I'm just thinking, like, what medical institutions are happy to grant that? It's just a total cosmetic decision, right?
Do they even know that she has autism? Do they even ask? I mean, you'd be shocked at the standards and the ease at which some of these, at least in the US context, some of these places, the Planned Parenthoods of the world just hand out hormone prescriptions.
Yeah.
It's not light stuff. I mean, It has very serious medical ramifications, so it should not be done lightly, and it should not be done as a form of just casual body modification or style, but that really does feel like a lot of what it is, especially with the non-binary types. And it's also just adds to the incoherence, because it's like, I don't identify as a man, but I want a beard so I can feel more comfortable in my gender of he, him. Like,
yeah. And it's also, I don't subscribe to gender rules, but then I need to take hormones to feel satisfied with my gender. So you're having to masculinize yourself to be more non-binary.
Non-binary is not a rejection of gender roles. It's an embrace of crude gender stereotypes just wrapped up in woke bubble wrap. But it doesn't change the fact that it's still the same old repressive and inconsistent principles, just in a new packaging and coming from a different crowd this time.
Totally. Well, maybe this next one will change your mind, Brad, because if you think non-binary is incoherent, you're about to have a lesson in what
Addison, a friend of mine is non-binary, but he doesn't use they, them pronouns. Is that allowed?
Let me check the non-binary rulebook. Oh, right. There's no such thing as a non-binary rulebook, because there's no single way to be non-binary.
Oh.
The gender binary says that there are two separate and opposite gender identities, woman or man, and there are strict rules around how to be a woman or man. There are no such rules for being non-binary.
Non-binary describes an array of gender identities that do not conform to binary gender.
Binary gender construction places whiteness as a standard of womanhood and manhood, as it was implemented largely through European colonization.
In many cases, this meant passing and enforcing laws that categorize people by gender and then force them to behave accordingly.
Gender policing impacts everything, not just the clothes we are allowed to wear, but also the ways we are supposed to behave, even with the protections we have.
Every individual has their own unique way of being and expressing themselves. 100 non-binary people will have 100 different ways of being non-binary.
There are infinite ways to be non-binary. You don't have to use specific pronouns or dress a certain way. Just be. That's enough.
So that was probably a lot, but I do hope you understand now, and you can respect these people.
The problem with this is that if there are infinite ways to be non-binary, and if non-binary doesn't entail any specific pronoun or presentation or anything, then non-binary is utterly and completely meaningless as a term and as a concept, and therefore not actually worthy of legitimacy or respect or recognition. I mean, if I told you that anything could mean anything, then it means nothing, right? The definition of meaning has to be specific. It can't be all-encompassing. And actually, can you go back in the video to where the person flashed the emojis towards the beginning? So look at this. What do we have for the man? We have biceps, the angry emoji, football, ties, eggplants, and then what do we have for the girl? We have lipstick, dresses, pregnancy, tears, and a bikini. Are we freaking serious? How do they not see that they're reinforcing stereotypes? They're literally using crude. Look at the text. There are strict rules around how to be a woman or a man. Yes, babe. And you're reinforcing them. You're not the radical gender anarchist you think you are. You're literally 1960s gender roles repackaged and reinforced. Girls can like football. Girls can wear ties. Girls can have bicep muscles and lift weights. All of this is made up. None of this is actually legitimate or inherent in sex. Now, the eggplant is inherent to your sex, right? So that
they would argue otherwise.
Right. The pregnancy emoji is, of course, they would also say that's offensive to say women can only get pregnant. So they're not even being consistent on their own level. But like that, okay, I'll give them that one. Men can cry. Men can wear makeup. There's no, like, makeup being only for girls is completely socially constructed and only relative in certain cultures and contexts. There are plenty of cultures and contexts where men can and do wear makeup. It's just face paint. Face paint doesn't have chromosomes. And like even dresses and clothes is made up. Like in our society, men don't really wear dresses, but there've been many societies where men do wear clothing that are very similar to dresses. And all of that is subject to change. Like none of that is actually, you're not breaking the binary. You're reinforcing it. Like, I don't know, because you're saying that if you're not those things, you can't be a man or a woman. You have to be something else. We're saying you can be all of those things and be a man or a woman because all it really is your sex. There's not much more to it than that. But you're the one actually attaching this entire category of things and personality-based elements to what is essentially just a biological distinction. Mm-hmm. How do they not see this when they're literally typing out those emojis? How can they be so obtuse to put it in the emojis? It should make it so apparent that it's wrong.
Yeah, and I'm thinking, well, if I identify as non-binary, does that mean I can now get pregnant? But I think the rules is an interesting. I'd like to see this rule book that they're talking about telling me what I'm allowed to do as a man, and I can empathize with, you know, the non-binary idea. If you grew up as a boy being told boys don't cry, you can't do this because you're a boy, like that is difficult, especially if it's a very feminine.
But the solution is,
Exactly.
So Jack, the solution there is to say, no, boys can do those things.
I was going to say that.
Not to say,
yeah,
you can do those things, but it makes you not a boy.
Yeah. It's giving into the idea, to the pressure your parent, you know, hypothetical parents would have put on you, is instead of saying F you, I'm a guy, I can do what I like, you're saying, okay, well, I'm going to listen to you and I'm going to create another category over here. And what's funny is they say there are no rules to being non-binary, but I think there are more rules because you have to hold a certain political belief. You have to be queer and so entrenched in the community. And you have to, like, there are more rules to being non-binary in that sense than there are to being a regular man or a woman, in my opinion. And that point about sets whiteness as a standard. I mean, I'd like to go to some tribes in Africa and see if they have traditional gender roles or not, because I'm thinking they probably do, right?
Yeah, they're acting like this whole thing about male versus female being an important tool of social organization is just completely a construct of Western civilization, and it's not. In fact, in Western civilization, the significance of it has faded over time. I actually think it's probably a very innate thing. And the more, you know, undeveloped a society or a culture, the more primal those influences and distinctions will be, not the less. But they're acting like, oh, well, we don't even think of things like this because of Western patriarchy or whatever. And I'm like, not really. I mean, if you go back to even the Native Americans, the people indigenous to North America had very strong concepts of what the men in the tribe did and the women did. It's like, this isn't an invention of white colonists or whatever, but they can only look at the world through a very specific lens, and they try to apply it to everything, and it just doesn't work.
And it's all rooted in just hating your country. Like, it's so sad. You know, you try putting them in another country, you'll see how they do with their non-binary. So, Brad, have you heard of Scoliosexuality?
No.
Well, you're about to.
One of the the first TikToks that came up on my For You page was talking about the term scoliosexual. Scoliosexual is used to describe one's primary attraction to transgender individuals, specifically non-binary trans people. The Greek root scolio means curved or bent. Now let's dive into, is scoliosexual a valid identity label, and if it is it harmful? Based on my general philosophy, almost all labels are valid. That is, I can see how you came to that conclusion that that is what you are. But on the question of whether or not this term is harmful, a hard yes. It just feels like fetishization.
A lot.
We need a complete and total shutdown on calling things harmful until we can figure out what's going on. That is the most overused word in the dictionary. Like, I would love to find me one individual whose material day-to-day life has been adversely affected by someone else using the label scoliosexuality. What? I mean, I almost am like, yes, call it harmful so that people won't use it and they'll stop making up fake things. But like, this over-indexing of what is harmful versus what is not is so counterproductive. And it's also like the same types will argue it's transphobic to not be into trans people. But then also, if you're specifically into trans people, that's bad. I mean, I don't know. There's no winning here. It seems like no matter what happens, we're problematic and bigoted and we lose.
It's always a problem. And this sexuality makes me laugh because it's saying you're specifically attracted to non-binary people. But remember, Brad, there are infinite ways to be non-binary. So essentially what they're describing is...
What does that mean then? Nothing.
It's either bisexual or you're attracted to someone with a certain political belief. And to be fair, I think there are people like that. And I feel like you sort of...
Well, I'm the opposite of a sapiosexual because I'm specifically not interested in anyone who identifies as non-binary.
Totally. Me too.
If I was back in my dating days, if I ever saw he/they, instant swipe left.
Massive red flag.
Hard pass.
It's like it's the most loaded Tinder profile or whatever you're using, isn't it? Like, it instantly paints such a broad picture of what this person is and what you're likely to get.
I instantly know this person's political ideology and that they cannot take a joke in any way, shape, or form.
Totally. So here's our last one, Brad. And it's weird because I feel like you really foreshadowed it in something you just said. So let's give it a go.
Hello, I'm Blue Trans Education, and I'm here to talk about why T for T is acceptable, but a cis person wanting to date specifically trans people isn't. Trans people are T for T because they feel it's a matter of safety. They would be safer if they only dated other trans people. And there's an added bonus of always having something in common. However, when cis people specifically want to date trans people, there's no reason other than fetishization. No cis person is dating trans people because it's a matter of safety, or because they have something in common with each and every trans person. If you have a really good reason as to why you, a cis person, wants to date trans people, that's fine. However, I honestly cannot think of any besides fetishization. Hope this helps!
One thing I'll say is that...
At the end of the videos always is so painful.
One thing I'll say is I don't know how safe I'd feel dating this person.
I don't even feel safe watching this person on the camera. I'm not going to be mean, but it's like you can't win, right? So it's the same thing I said a minute ago. If you're not into trans people, you're transphobic, you're a bigot. If you're specifically into them, you're a fetishist and you're bad. I mean, is it really this complicated? I mean, I feel like actual trans people don't have that hard a time like getting a date, and they don't need this 1,000 levels of analysis about what's problematic versus what's not. Like, just go date people, just go live your life. Like, why does everything need to be put through this microscopic lens of just like identity and oppression and intersectionality? And oh my goodness, the whole safety thing is I guess I get what they're saying, but like, the solution is to find an individual with whom you are safe, right? And that individual could be trans, or they could be cis, or that an unsafe individual could be trans too. That doesn't guarantee you any safety. Trust me. Unfortunately, a lot of the deaths of transgender people that do happen are at the hands of intimate partners. And sometimes those partners are members of the LGBT or are fellow non-binary or trans people. So the idea that that would guarantee you safety is also strange.
Totally. And it's just funny, that concept of fetishization, because they say the same thing if someone says, I'm attracted to, Black people more, Asian people more. I used to buy into that. Oh, you're just fetishizing them. But, if you think about it, race is just sort of a constellation of physical attributes. And it's natural you may be more drawn to one over the other. It's the same with men.
I've always found that argument strange. Like, oh, well, not being attracted to this racial group is racist. Okay, is not being attracted to women sexist then? Like, why are we policing people's attraction to other adults when it's not really up for their control? The entire endeavor seems futile to me.
Yeah, and all of us know deep down that attraction is just what it is. The heart wants what it wants. And there are men who are particularly into trans women, just like we're into men, but it doesn't say anything specific about them. They could be great guys who just want to meet a trans woman. So that was great. I was very pleased to get to react to those with you, because I've been watching yours for so long, and it's really cool. It's really strange to see this man in the computer like now doing it with you. But I really appreciate it. So, Brad, I'm sure that everyone knows where to find you, but where can they go to see more of Brad Polumbo?
Yeah, just go to the Brad Polumbo YouTube channel or check out the Damage Control podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Great. Thank you so much, Brad. Have a great day.
Thanks for having me.